From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with audio communication.
Hi and welcome to episode 4. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This podcast series is all about exploring the huge opportunities offered by podcasts, in particular for businesses looking for innovative ways to grow their brand. Coming up on this episode, we talk to Corey Layton of Australian podcast platform Whooshkaa, and we chat to Castaway Awards judge Sophie Kneebone. I'm joined as always by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore. And I have to ask Chris, it's been several weeks since the launch of the much anticipated S-Town. Have you had time to listen to all 7 episodes yet?
Hi Nick, yes, I binged. As soon as it came out, I binged over the first few days, but I've got to say, after a couple of episodes, I almost didn't continue listening. If you read or hear about some of the reviews on S-Town, some pretty mixed reactions actually, and I can understand where some of that negativity is coming from, because I too was questioning after a couple of episodes, was it worth my time and effort to continue to listen to it?
And why is that?
Well, it just got boring. It wasn't what I thought it would be, and they did change course in the storyline of the podcast. It was pretty stale after 2 or 3 episodes, and one other thing was that the protagonist, John B. McLemore, was just so depressing. I understand that was the whole point of the podcast, but gee whiz, it was tough getting through it. But I'm glad I did, because towards the end, and particularly the last couple of episodes, or chapters as they call it, I really enjoyed it. And it got me thinking afterwards, for days after, about the story and how well they've done it. And it just kept sticking in my mind, just like a good book.
Do you think some of the negative press or some of the negative thoughts you had were because of the way it was marketed in the lead-up? Well, we sort of sold a bit of a furphy by Serial and This American Life, because it was sort of marketed as a murder mystery, and because Serial, that week-by-week investigation style of podcast that we've been used to, do you think that was a bit cheeky to launch it that way?
I think for a lot of people it was. They were anticipating that. But personally for me, I tried not to read too many of the reviews or the lead up to it, because I really wanted a blank slate when listening to it. So that wasn't the reason for me. It was just that it was just boring in parts, and it could have been done in 2 or 3 episodes and not the full 7.
But for a boring podcast, wow, the results have been pretty exceptional. 10 million downloads in the first 4 days, which has broken every record. With Serial, which I guess to date is still the most downloaded and popular podcast, it took 7 weeks to get to 10 million. So pretty impressive. Also, what's pretty impressive is it took 3 years to produce that podcast.
Ridiculous. Not 3 full years, but I think one of those years was a full-time job for the host of the show. But yeah, it took a long time, and could they have come up with something different? But I mean, all said and done, I did think it was very well done. Yeah,
I have to agree. I really enjoyed it, and I did binge it. That binge listening is interesting, because that was a bit of a change for Serial and This American Life by launching all episodes at the same time, which was a bit different. But I think it worked for them, because clearly with so many downloads so quickly, that binging worked. It's now, how long will it be before Serial can release season 3, because they've got a captive audience, and now we're waiting for something. So interesting, different tactic of how to launch and release a podcast, but it seems to have worked so far.
And it'll be interesting to see what else they come out with, Serial and This American Life, in this space.
Absolutely. Speaking of the best podcasts going round, the Castaway Podcast Awards were awarded recently, and later on this episode we're going to hear from one of the judges, Sophie Kneebone, including her predictions for the podcast industry.
I think the biggest thing that will happen in the next few years is that advertising on podcasts will grow. I think host-read ads on podcasts especially will become more and more popular as more advertisers jump on board. This in turn I think is going to increase the demand for more specific and more detailed, more comprehensive analytics.
That's Sophie Kneebone, a judge at this year's inaugural Castaway Awards, a little later. But first, I speak with Corey Layton, Content and Marketing Director at Whooshkaa, a relatively new player in the Australian podcasting space. Whooshkaa founder Rob Lowenthal was previously Managing Director of Macquarie Radio Network and was joined by Corey and several others with significant commercial radio experience. Stepping into podcasting from radio is an obvious natural transition, but a question everyone wants to know, I asked Corey, why the name Whooshkaa?
It's a colloquial kind of term where our boss, the CEO and founder, a guy by the name of Rob Lowenthal, he uses it often when, you're flying at speed and something's going whooshkaa is really how he uses it. But the thing about us is we're about helping people ensure that their numbers of listens to their audio goes whooshkaa, and also the ideas that we create for brands and content does much the same. So like the best way to probably describe us as a full service audio on demand company, and we're about helping creators and brands do a bunch of things: produce, host, share, track, monetize their content. And that breaks down in a few different ways, from being a free platform for audio hosting, as in iTunes doesn't hold your audio, so you've got to put it somewhere. So we do that together with having all the distribution tools, and we've got access to Facebook's API and have a really unique Facebook player which plays natively, which is a really exciting feature that we have. We also connect creators and brands together. So when it comes to dynamic ad insertion into their shows, right through to integrated partnerships is a big part of what we offer. It's difficult to take a radio ad and drop it into a podcast because it's such an intimate experience, and hearing a jingle and radio ads are designed to stand out from a bank of 10 other ads. And in a podcast, often the only ad you hear is one ad, and I think if they're constructed in the same way, it's quite jarring and doesn't work for the brand, doesn't work for the creator, and ultimately doesn't work for the listener. Anyone that gets into podcasts, it's about having the host deliver the ad. And if not the host, it's about having a personality deliver a story and something that's a little bit deeper than the facts or the proof points about a certain product or service.
Because that resonates more with the listener, having the host do the ad.
Yeah, I mean, listeners are actively sitting down and going, right, my favourite topic to listen to is X, and I'm going to put my headphones on and I'm going to enjoy this experience. And I think they're understanding that in return of free content, there's a need for that creator to make money in some way, shape or form. But it's also important that the way in which that's done doesn't interfere with the experience and really adds to it, and having it constructed in a content-rich way, the same as the podcast is really important, or else it's just interruption and noise.
Well, you guys, you spoke of Rob Lowenthal before. You guys are from radio yourself, you've mentioned, but
Yep.
And Rob was managing director at Macquarie Radio Network. From your perspective then, how different is podcasting from radio, or do you simply see it as an extension of radio?
Podcast, for me, the difference is, in parts, it is an extension of radio. It's particularly a catch-up style podcast where it's, you missed out on the breakfast show, here are the best bits that you missed. What podcasting does offer that I don't think radio can is breadth, where it can cover all sorts of specific niches on a wide range of topics. So if you're into podcasting, you can listen to a podcast about podcasting. Mm-hmm. Radio is not going to play a radio show about podcasting because it just doesn't make sense. So the breadth of topics that you can find that caters to you, it's similar in a lot of ways to Netflix. It's on demand. It's the content that you want when you want, and that for me is the massive difference between podcasting and radio.
Well, broadly speaking, Corey, where are we at with podcasting in Australia at the moment?
12% of the Australian population listen to podcasts. It's said that by the end of this year, that'll get up to 39%. When you dig into that a bit deeper, that means 39% will have listened to a podcast across the year. But for those people that do, they're consuming large amounts, over 3 hours a week. So it just goes to show that once you're in, you're very much in. You can't get enough. And it's led really to the explosion of content. Influencers are creating extraordinary amounts of great content globally and in Australia. Publishers are really considering and what they should do and doing some great work as well. And you even look at the ABC, who are trialling talent formats. They've even created a TVC campaign to help drive take-up of podcasts. I think the Australian podcasting industry and globally is looking really healthy.
And the more we talk about it, the better it is for the industry too. Yeah?
Which all helps.
What about large corporates in Australia or even smaller companies? They probably at this stage don't quite understand the advantages of audio and how it can help their marketing and connecting with an audience. What do you think? How can podcasting be an opportunity for brands? And do you have any examples?
Yeah, I think it's an immense opportunity. For me, what brands can achieve that isn't this is our product, this is our price in podcasting, to actually create their own entertainment or utility-based content. It's real, and it's also really cost-effective. And so you look at some of the companies that are playing in this space, they're able to take their brand purpose. What does our brand stand for? And make the podcast about that, which is often a step aside from what they do, but it's powerful. So a great example for me is GE. GE do some incredible work both in Australia and the US that talks to innovation. So the moment you go, how can we tell a podcast about innovation? They've explored that in multiple ways. There's a great podcast out of Australia called Decoding Genius, which is about childhood geniuses, and really plays to that innovation message of looking to the future, looking at who our future innovators are and what they're doing, right through to a couple of other US podcasts called The Message and also Life After, both from GE, which are drama podcasts. Have you heard them?
I have, yeah. They're fantastic.
They're incredible, and the amount of branding in them is really minimal, and that's because I think GE is brave enough to go, let's back in exciting, innovative concepts and tell those stories knowing that our brand will be part of that. I think there's other brands like Slack who create a podcast called Work in Progress is a really good example. Gimlet do some great work in this space. They've just released a podcast for Tinder.
Right. This is the US.
This is in the US. It's for Tinder called DTR, Define the Relationship, where they've taken the data that Tinder has and they've used it to tell stories. So it's things like the word hey is overused as that very first. So you swipe right, you get a connection, apparently, and the word hey is used significantly. So they analysed what's the success rate of using hey and followed some of the people's stories where hey began right through to the use of GIFs. I think apparently significantly increases your chances in the dating game. So they've gone through to look at who's creating those GIFs and why do they create them. So
it's a matter of being creative with an agency to get that message that resonates with the audience, and it can be powerful.
Yeah, and I also think just letting that agency or whoever those creators are that are working on it be flexible enough to let them find the richest content angles to tell a story that is in some way connected back to your brand, in the knowledge that all your own channels will then be able to amplify it, in the knowledge that you'll be able to put it through any paid media that best finds your audience. And you can do things like Facebook posting or who is the talent, how can you leverage them? There's some great ways that you can make sure you're then targeting your audience and getting them to see that it's from you, albeit it's not about you.
It can be expensive though. I mean, the production costs for the message alone would have been quite high.
I would imagine they would have been significant. You know, advertising spends don't need to be big, and nor do content creation spends. But it really does come down to the format, the regularity. You know, when you talk about a drama podcast and you think about actors, and actually maybe I need some name actors and I need a script writer and I need to sound design that, and how many episodes over what period of time, that costs. However, can be really rewarding, right through to maybe I do want to get a few people together to talk about a sporting game and integrate my brand. That can also be a really viable and cost-effective option.
That's Corey Layton, Content and Marketing Director at Whooshkaa.
It's really important how Corey was talking about podcasts being part of a broader content marketing strategy, and that you can also use podcasts in your current social media and to amplify that message, but it being a part of what you're doing, not a standalone feature, I think is really important. He also mentioned DTR, which is the branded podcast from Tinder. Do you know what a DP is?
No.
Well, that's probably good. Probably means you're not on Tinder. It's a dick pic. And they dedicated one entire episode of their 6-part series to dick pics, which I thought was interesting, and we'll probably move on from that. But what I do want to ask you about that Tinder-branded podcast is, why would you, as a brand, run additional ads when you're paying to brand the podcast?
I don't know. I didn't know that they did that, but I would imagine for most brands they don't do that. And I suppose for Tinder, maybe they've got such a large audience and perhaps they've got other relationships in play with other organisations that they are doing that and getting extra revenue. So I suppose it's okay as long as it doesn't intrude too much on the listener experience, and that goes for any ad anyway, yeah?
No, that's exactly right. And that's what Corey was saying about that delicate art form that ads in podcasts are. He talked about dynamic ads and making sure that any ads and brand messages need to add to the listener experience, and I think that's really important. You don't want to interrupt that experience with a listener on a podcast.
What I'm interested in, though, is how good this podcast is. I haven't listened to the DP one or whatever it was that you said, but I've listened to some, and it is a really good podcast. For those who are maybe young and single or on the dating scene, these are the kinds of conversations that, you kind of have with your friends. It's not earth-shattering stuff. It's quite mundane, but, geez, it's fun kind of conversations that they've done well, and it really wraps around their brand. And they've got great vox pops. They have great interviews with people on the street and people who use Tinder. So it's a great conversation around that brand, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Easy listening, well-produced podcast, which is what we like to promote. Speaking of good podcasts, you spoke with Sophie Kneebone on her thoughts on what makes a good and bad podcast.
Yes, like Corey Layton, Sophie's one of the judges at this year's inaugural Castaway Awards, who until recently was podcast manager at Omni Studio. And Sophie tells me she's optimistic about the industry in Australia and is particularly upbeat about how engaging the medium is between presenter and listener.
You have this incredibly unique, quite intimate relationship when you're listening to a podcast because the host is right there in your ears. You feel like you're getting to know them. You're getting an insight into their life. You're hearing their voice as if they're speaking directly to you, and you build up quite a lot of trust. And something I know about all of the podcasters that I've ever spoken to is that they're very protective of their content and they take that relationship and that trust very seriously. And the listeners know that. And so they're not going to advertise a product unless they genuinely endorse it, unless they really believe in it. And the listeners trust them to do that. And I can't think of any other platform where I trust someone to advertise a genuine product to me. And the other thing is that when you're listening to a podcast, you've made a conscious choice to plug yourself in and listen for that amount of time. It's a much more effective place to recommend a product than, say, a billboard that someone might happen to drive past, or an ad on TV that's only shown in an ad break where most people get up and make a cup of tea. Like they're there to listen to the show. And if you make the ad part of the show, an entertaining part of the show, like really good podcasters do, then it's an incredibly compelling platform for advertisers.
What's the future of podcasting in 60 seconds?
That's the $1 million question. I think the biggest thing that will happen in the next few years is that advertising on podcasts will grow. I think host-read ads on podcasts especially will become more and more popular as more advertisers jump on board. This in turn I think is going to increase the demand for more specific and more detailed, more comprehensive analytics. I think there's a little bit of almost fear around getting more detail in the data because maybe people don't necessarily want to know in great detail whether people are listening or not, but I think it's going to become important. I think it's going to be a bit of a learning curve that we're all going to have to go through. And there's going to be, I think, a bit more streamlining of the way things are done. There's a group at the moment called Syndicated Media based in the States, but it's podcasting companies from all over the world and all different podcasting companies as well, all working together. Omni's a part of it, to sort of, have conversations around how podcasting could be improved and whether there's things that we can do to make the experience better for the listener and things like that. It's quite exciting, it's a very open community, which I really like. And I think podcasting as a whole is going to benefit from those open discussions and make it better for anyone. I mean, maybe that's a really naive answer, but I'd like to think that this community spirit that's alive and kicking among the podcasting community keeps going.
What do you think has held back podcasting until now? Has it been the lack of technology and the lack of ease to listen to podcasts?
That's an interesting question. Podcasting has been around for quite a long time. I know everyone kind of talks about Serial being the thing that pushed the podcasting boom, which in some ways is true, but when you actually look at the data of podcast listenership from when Apple invented it, it's actually been growing quite steadily since then. The boom isn't as significant as you might think. So I think it is developments in technology and just awareness of it. More and more people got the iPhone, and then the iPhone had the podcasting app in it in this new generation, and that kind of thing really, really pushed the awareness, and more people started listening to it. And I think money is a huge part of it, because you can be the most passionate content maker in the world, but you've either got to have a day job or be making money from your content. I know that from nearly a decade's experience in producing content. There comes to a point where something's got to give. And so I think now that there's more of an ability to, with platforms like Patreon, you've got this platform where you can say to your listeners, hey, I need you to help me out here with money. That's a huge part of being able to grow podcasting and make it actually a viable part of a content maker's life. So I think it's a multitude of things that have both held back podcasting and now are starting to really move it forward.
That was Sophie Kneebone.
Sophie's point about the intimate relationship between podcaster and creator is a theme that keeps coming up. It's really like the host is talking to me when I listen to a podcast, and that's certainly how the trust builds up so quickly.
That's right.
Well, what's coming up on the next episode of Be Podcasting?
In episode 5 is Matthew Gain, country manager of Audible Australia. For those who don't know, Audible is the audio content arm of the book-selling behemoth of Amazon. The audio content space is not only growing with podcasts, but it's also reflected in the huge gains in audiobooks. And here's a snippet.
We have a real passion for creating original content here in Australia, and I think you'll see some more of that from us in the future. When it comes to the future of audio, I think that we've only just started, and the possibilities of how people will consume audiobooks in the future is something I love to think about, and I think that down the track, the possibilities are endless.
That's Matthew Gain, head of Audible Australia.
Another big episode coming up, and so that you don't miss out, why not subscribe to Be Podcasting in iTunes? Actually, not iTunes anymore, because last week Apple rebranded and they're now calling it Apple Podcasts. And we're now in Stitcher as well, so if you're on an Android device, you can find us there. And if you want to know more about us and the podcasting world, we've just launched our brand new website at be.com.au. And that ends episode 4 of Be Podcasting. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.